Okay, well, morning everyone, and thank you for making the time to join us at this ICRR seminar. And we're delighted to have Professor Dan Nyberg as our speaker today. Before I go on, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and future. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including those that may be with us here today. Daniel Nyberg, our speaker, probably fairly well known to a number of you in the room. Dan is Professor of Sustainability at University of Queensland Business School, and he built a terrific portfolio of work over the years, which explores things such as responses to climate change, on projects in the transition to a low carbon economy, on the politics of adaptation, and on how corporate political activities influence public policy. He's published widely on those topics in a number of highly esteemed international peer-reviewed journals, and he's also, along with Chris Wright and Vanessa Bowden, published at least 2 books in the domains I've just articulated. Previously to University of Queensland, he's worked at the University of Newcastle and the University of Sydney, where I had the pleasure of working with him on a project along with Chris on business responses and climate change, which was more years ago than I care to remember. Yes. But perhaps that was part of the start of the journey to where we are today. No, I mean that. But look forward to hearing Dan's talk this morning, which is around politics and fossil fuel hegemony, which is something that he is also very well known for. Over to you, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. Thank you also for the Institute for inviting me down, and also thank you for Melody for a very productive day yesterday and shouting me lunch. That was lovely, and it's awesome to see so many faces that I recognize. Makes it a little bit easier to feel at them, a friendly space when I present. So it's really nice to see all of you I've met before, and then good to see new faces too. So this comes out of a larger project with Chris and Vanessa on the low carbon transition in Australia. We got a Discovery grant for it, but quite early on recognized, there's not a lot of transitioning happening. So we were planning to study how Australia is moving away from fossil fuel, which is happening that quickly. So it wasn't a lot to study. So we slightly changed focus to understanding why we're not transitioning faster. I'm not saying there's no transition. We're saying perhaps it's not as fast as it could be. So we changed the tack, and that is, I guess, what I'm going to talk to a little bit today. Why we're not changing fast in Australia to some form of low carbon transition or low carbon economy. And that is working. So the paper is really discussing the research question is how is utopian politics used to defend fossil fuel hegemony. So with hegemony, we talk about as a form of social order, common sense, a non-violent, coercive, non-coercive common sense of how we understand the world. So we're arguing here, I guess, that the fossil fuel provide moral political leadership in the nation to sustain a form of dominance, that the only way forward is through fossil fuel. So despite the many pledges from companies, including fossil fuel, to go net zero, despite most signing up to diverse international agreement, fossil fuel is still going up. Carbon emissions are still going up. Some would argue we perhaps have plateaued a little bit, but whether that is due to economic stagnation or actually a transition is perhaps debatable. Even so, we have seen over the last few years quite a lot of social movements demanding quicker actions, including here in Australia, climate strikes, school for climate strikes, and other protesters, at least before COVID. We also see a lot of scientists continuously warning us about climate change, So I won't do a climate change lecture for this room. I assume if you're interested in institute here, you know the situation we're facing. But all I'm trying to do here is suggesting on one hand, we have all the warning, we have the protest. Other hand, what is happening is that the fossil fuel dominant actors is basically more or less defending the status quo. So what we're suggesting in this paper, the status quo is dependent on providing slightly different futures. So not only what we're doing in Australia at the moment, but also what are the futures we can imagine? What are the future possible for us? And that we can understand. So this is what we try to figure out in this paper, how they mobilize futures to ensure we're going basically nowhere. And this paper I'm talking today is only part of the project. So it's only from the fossil fuel positions. So here we're not talking about NGOs or protests. It's only talking about what fossil fuel industry, the politicians align with it, the different industry associations, what they are saying. And I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about methods in 10 minutes or so. So this is the basic setup. So before I articulate how to do it, I thought I'd just stop by a little bit on the politics of it in terms of what we mean by hegemony and what we mean by defending the status quo in that sense. So as I suggested, hegemony is a non-coercive way of sustaining dominance. Doesn't mean that violence or coerciveness is not hovering in the background. But the key for hegemony is providing leadership to articulate what is seen as common sense that we all can agree upon. And that is how the dominance happens. So, and as we see, even though coercion is not part of hegemony necessarily, it often lurks in the background. So if we have too much protests, there might be violence against those protests, perhaps new laws diminishing the possibilities to protest. But this coerciveness is not the key aspect of hegemony. Rather, how hegemony works is creating a clear division. So us versus them. We normally see that in other forms of politics, where we create a person that is perhaps different, that we don't like, that we can look down upon, to make us feel better. So the us and them is an important aspect, because if you can't have an other, you can't have an us. So hegemony is dependent on making sure that you articulate someone who is different, that may be dangerous or just naive, perhaps a little silly. But that other is part of making sure that you can create an equivalence with your coalition, your group. You're the in-group. We can all agree. Well, we might not all always agree on particular aspects. All our demands, identities might be different, but we can all agree that they are wrong. So we can then mobilize our identity interest, even though they may be different. We might have different demands, but at least there's another difference that is bigger. A political frontier suggesting we in our group, we are slightly different, but we are sensible. We know what is best for the nation. While those others, they don't. This is basically how hegemony works. So it's a continuous struggle. It's not set in stone. So hegemony here, at least later discussion around hegemony, doesn't situate this in a class structure. So it's not a classical Marxist that the bourgeois is one group and the workers are one group and the elite is one group. This is much more contingent and fluent, which means we can have coalitions across what is normally class structures, if that makes sense. So, and this can also shift. The fact that it's contingent means also that we can create new coalitions, win over people to our side, or lose people to the other side. So this is then a continuous struggle. So hegemony is both the contingent order that we seem to be stabilized at the moment, but also the struggle for that dominance. And we're particularly interested in then how these groups use imaginaries of the future to create this common sense of where Australia should go in the future and how we can achieve that future. So imaginaries here then, I guess the way to hold these groups together. We collectively understand what is best for us, what meaning, symbols we draw upon when we're calling us Australians, or the people, or the real Australians, or those who are in the know, rather than those who doesn't understand. So with these meanings, symbols, understandings, it is imaginaries. And they normally have, not necessarily, but normally have some form of utopian element, because they are not whole or completed. They're always open for contestation. So we want to understand how this leads to a better future, especially under turbulence, where there's different alternatives up for grabs. We want to know, how can we move forward? What are the possibilities for this nation or for this group? So the utopian elements is that, I guess, on one hand, the desire, the basic desire to move forward. Here we're thinking more about utopian in a political sense of creating a better place. So all imaginaries about the future have some utopian elements because they're not closed. There's always the possibilities of a better future. But this better future naturally also can come with dystopia. So when someone is saying, yeah, we can really move into a completely fossil fuel free Australia, some would argue, no, that would mean economic collapse. That would mean energy poverty. That would mean dystopia. So utopian politics normally comes with some form of dystopia. Now, sure, we can go down this track, but it might not lead where you want it to be. It actually could be a disaster for the nation. So there's also a dystopian element to a lot of arguments. It's sort of, if we don't do this, this is catastrophic. Or if we do what they say, it's going to turn to. So utopian thinking is this political operation we're interested in understanding how futures are made. And as again, this is fossil fuels. When we talk to them, and I'm going to return to a little bit to methods now to get a sense of who we spoke to. But this is sort of the theoretical background. So how the future is up for grabs and how the fossil fuel industry in Australia is trying to operate and politically maneuver about this future to create a common sense among us to say, this is basically the only pathway forward. So what we did here, we talked to 57 people, 16 around them are CEOs, managers in fossil fuel industry. We have, but also from energy retailers who also are well equipped to talk about this. And we talked to lobbyists and industry groups, which was great discussions. We also talked to politicians and the staff. So around half, a little bit less than half is politicians, around half, a little bit more is around industry association, fossil fuel executives, and lobbyists. So these were the people we talked to. Two of these politicians were former prime ministers. Obviously can't name any name, but it wouldn't be hard to figure out who can be a little bit disgruntled with the status quo. And also a state premier is in the data set. We're trying to then understand how they see the lack of energy transition. We also then look into the Hansard record for the transcript from Parliament. We did press releases from the big industries, fossil fuel industries, the industry groups, Minerals Council Australia, and these kind of places. And then also some media, some key media, the big media in Australia. Trying to collect this, so this is the data set where we then to figure out how do they do this politics. So in the data analysis, we found that it basically was 4 key imaginaries these people talk about. On one hand, they talk about green utopian fantasies, and these are the protesters or the greenies and environmentalists. We want renewable tomorrow. That's a bit of a utopian fantasy. Or they spoke about the dark dystopia. If we move too quick, it's going to wreck the economy. What about the people in India who's dependent on Australian coal? Why would you want to hurt them? We also have utopian technofix. We can solve this. We have our own counter-conservative utopia. We have carbon capture and storage. This could help us to move to a much better future. But also a status quo, and I will argue soon how this is a form of utopian argument. Well, look, this basically saying, look, the only alternative is what we're doing today. Basically, the TINA. There is no alternative. We also saw how they're operating, and this is where they go back to the hegemony and the political strategies, how they try to correlate this common sense. It was clear there is a political frontier. When we spoke to them about the political landscape of Australia, they were clear that, oh, sorry if I'm wrong, move away from the picture. Yeah, sorry. I think the picture would be better without me. So how they establish political frontier, it's clear that they see often themselves as victims, and there is another that could be politicians, often is protesters who doesn't understand the situation. But they're also different between with their opponents. So not all protests are equally bad. There's a clear division, and I'll talk a little bit about this too. So not only are they trying a political frontier between us and them, they also fragment the opponents in their own discourses. So this is just them. We haven't spoken to the NGOs protesters. But they're also trying to build equivalence here, build equivalence with those who care about the environment. Not the dangers are there, more the naive are there. And I'm going to show that too. And then obviously they try to construct a path between what Australia has been doing, the fossil fuel dependency we have had in this country, to a future that basically look more or less the same. But this future is important. So they're creating a path between the past and the future. So just to make a quick explanation, this is basically what I said. You can see here what are the constructed imaginaries. A green utopia then is seen as, I guess, an impossible dream. You have a dark dystopia. This is undesirable place, economic collapse, energy poverty, mass unemployment, perhaps. You have a utopian technofix, where through brilliant innovation, corporate innovation, and technologies, we can address this. And then we have a status quo, where we argue is a form of anti-utopia. So so dystopia is not the opposite of utopia. Status quo is opposite of utopia, because then there's no, I guess, temporal movement. So this is just a few examples, and I'm going to now go through those in 4 slides, and then I'm going to read some form of the conclusion. So I will walk you through this, and apologies, it's going to be a little bit more text heavy now, just to get your sense of flavor, what they're saying. So some of these slides are going to be a little bit text intensive, but I think when you see the text, you're going to think, yeah, it's worth it. I hope so, at least. So establishing a political frontier, this is key then for any form of hegemony. There is a them and an us. And here we see an CEO electricity retailer saying it's naive to think that we can turn off coal tomorrow. So sure, they might have a point, but this is naive. Like, this is not how it works in the real world. Or lobbyists for coal suggesting, when you drill down to the activist view, the anti-coal, they couldn't tell you anything about it. Again, they're not equipped to understand these things. And there's also some quotes in the paper about they don't really understand the basic science of climate change. So there's a clear us versus them. They are a bit hysterical. The demands are almost religious. They are like fanatics a bit. They want all this, but they don't really understand how it works. So this is the frontier. You can see how there's a we who understand, we believe in science, we don't understand economics, and those who doesn't really. There's also differentiating the opponents, and this is a pretty cool quote, I think, at least fun in a sense. Where I really worry is that it's inevitable that some probably younger person is going to go onto a mine site, a port site, a rail line, and get themselves killed. They're just the cannon fodder of older, politically motivated, radical people. Even though they say it's organic and there's no hierarchy, they're old-time Marxist trots. Because seeing the ability to bring around the revolution via other means, then manipulating young people, have you noticed? It's always the young people who get arrested. So it's also a key aspect here is not all the opponents are equally bad. On one hand, we have the naive children who doesn't understand. On the other hand, another part of that is the dangerous others. Those who want to ruin the economy, bring back a communist revolution. So this comes up a few times, that on one hand, we have those naive school children who really should be back at school, shouldn't be protesting, they should be learning. We don't want the school to be activist, we want to be a place for learning. But on the other hand, we have the corrupting influence of these older, perhaps, as in here, Marxist trots, who is polluting the young, naive people's mind with their silly ideas. So here you can see they're trying, in this utopian thinking here, or politics, they are make a separation between the naive and those who are disrupting, laying on the ground, putting life at risk, who basically want to overthrow the social order. So this is then two possible others, but to create a larger coalition, you would then try to attract some of this. So in creating a larger equivalence or a larger in-group, a larger coalition, you can also build equivalence with those, perhaps those a bit naive and those who are not educated, because you can then suggest that, look, our imaginaries of the future is not that different. So because we have actually technology to sort this out. Carbon capture and storage here is better than the silver bullet of renewable, because this can perhaps get us there. So often in these discussions, they're not against renewable. They're suggesting that renewable is not ready yet. We need gas as a perhaps transition fuel. So methane gas or is a transition fuel. We could back up renewable, so we can get there. It complements renewable. We all want the same thing, except obviously for those really dangerous who want to overthrow the social order. But most of us, we want the same thing. We want a nice future for our children, a green future. So we can do that while making profit. So this is a classic win-win, but we can include the environmental concerns without profit making through technology and innovation. So then the final slide here with a little bit of quotes is suggesting that we have always been the sensible center here in moving Australia forward. The industry is here arguing for positive impact of the society for people, workers, communities dependent on fossil fuel. So this is the long-term solution. We will get there. We just take a bit slower than perhaps many of you who are environmental concerned want, but we will get there. So in that sense, the sensible center here can use this knowledge. They have the scientific expertise, they have the economic resources, they are the responsible or good corporate citizen. They want best for Australia too, of course. So high quality coal will be able to deliver this. So rather than talking about no coal, we should talk about high quality coal or moving to gas. It's a little bit cleaner according to them. And this instance is slowly moving to a future. And arguing here even that they agree on net zero, just not zero, not zero emission from coal, just emission from coal contribute to in the future. So that's the aspiration. And many of these companies have, at least in the past, some of them walked back on the promises because of the new requirements for Australian companies. But you can see here, there's a path to the future, and that is what we're doing now. Slowly moving there. We're getting there. You don't want to wreck the economy to go there. So, and then suggesting how they construct this hegemony, we put a little picture here. You can then see how the four things we talked about is trying to do this. On one hand, you can see how they establish a political frontier, us versus them. The them is those dark disposition, the Marxist trots, but also those naive children. Secondly, you differentiate these opponents. So one that you will never try to reel in, that you because you need an other. Every hegemony need an other. Otherwise, because that's a central aspect of the coalition. So you can separate them, and then the third movement is then try to bring those who care about the environment along with the road with you. So obviously, we both care about the environment, and you're not particularly dangerous, just naive. I will educate you. I will provide you with resources and understanding, and then you will come along to a more of our side of the future. And finally, we will provide a path for reaching that future to suggest, look, the present is pretty good. And we would continue this into a future through what is often referred to as technology, innovation, and these kind of things. So this is basically how we argue that they're using utopian politics to stabilize, uphold, and strengthen, I guess, hegemony. So in the paper, we argue that hegemony is then defended through this kind of utopian politics. And we have only looked from the industry side how they are portraying others. So we're not saying this green utopian is the NGO's utopian, or that these protests is providing this dark dystopia. We're not saying that. We're only saying this is the imaginaries that the industry gives to these people. So they're then seen as impossible or naive or even dangerous. And then they can promote the alternative, which is basically a conservative, techno-fixed future where we can, through technology innovation, reach a greener net zero transition. And here we try to show that temporal narratives is important to connect that past with the present and future, and how the fossil fuel has really been the backbone of Australia's past, bringing Australia a lot of wealth. It's really working at the moment to provide a lot of resources, jobs for communities, but also they will be here in the future to support Australia and their communities. And that's sort of the end of my talk. This is the last slide, that second last slide. A little bit too quick, perhaps, or just half an hour. It's probably, yeah. So we're arguing here that these future images shape political struggles, and that this utopian politics that they provide is hampering, perhaps, discussions in Australia. Where there is no alternative, there limits the possibilities for us to discuss these alternatives. So here, what we suggest is, on one hand, there's been quite a few studies about real utopias. Eric Olin Wright's idea about the existing utopias here we can draw upon, green, renewable communities, more publicly owned resources, grids that is governed by community groups, but also perhaps decentralized. There exist these places in the world, and also popping up in Australia. Complementing this, we also argue in the paper we need an anti-utopian assess. The possibilities to have discussions about others. So the possibilities to open up this field for, I guess, more radical suggestions, or arguing that another world is possible. There is not just one way to look at this. There's other ways to look at this. There's other ways of utopia. So our argument is not against utopian politics, is an anti-utopian politics in the sense we need to be able to talk about alternatives or alternative future, alternative worlds, without seeing as utopian or dystopian or dangerous. Thank you.
So we've clearly got a good amount of time for questions.
Yeah.
You're at the front of your one, as people ask.
Yes, I probably need a pen and paper. Or at least 10, yeah.
Jack.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Dan. Super interesting work. My question was, how is hegemony in your mind separated from, I guess, routine political mobilization? I'm sure there's some definitional aspect to it. The reason I asked that question was I could imagine the other side of this debate employing very similar tactics to kind of wrestle us towards one side or the other. So I guess I'm just wondering, is this, how do we think about this in the context of these actors? Like, is this a story of power and them kind of dominating the debate, or is it the story of them using these tactics more effectively than others? Not a very clear question.
No, that's all right. So hegemony is then sense neutral. We're not suggesting that only fossil fuel use these tactics. These are political tactics could be used to any side. Arguably, if you want to change this this is perhaps what you should do. And since we're not focused on class or identity as a whole, contingent, we can then mobilize those who perhaps disagree with it. So, for example, I am I flew here, right? And then I talk about climate change. My identity is clearly split. On one hand, I don't want flight prices to go up. I don't want to ban flying. But on the other hand, I understand the importance of climate change. So if a political group suggests that we should perhaps have a legislation around limited air miles, I could be mobilized to that. So this is the key, that I have contradictory political demands, which means I can be maneuvered to share demands with others. So in that sense, if you want a counter-hegemony, a transition to renewable, this is exactly what you can do. You can capture those people in the city that are a bit ambivalent. But it's harder to capture those who are, I guess, more polarized. And this is, I guess, the problem with politics at the moment, that the demands becomes more singular. If with this polarization, it's much harder to mobilize because the other is so far apart. But if you think about classical politics, or at least up to maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was a big hurdle in the center that you could get into your position. So counter-hegemony would work exactly the same way. Also one. Oh, wow. Yes. How do we navigate truth, fact, persuasion, influence in an age of fake news? Yes, it is really tricky, and we have interviews are pretty good in the sense that we can ground it in people's beliefs and ideas. So here we don't necessarily make a big difference whether this what they're saying is true or not, because we're analyzing the political usage of the information rather than whether the information is correct. So whether they are saying things is true or not true, for example, when they claim that the protester wants to get to renewable tomorrow, no one has ever made that argument that we can stop coal overnight. So it's not whether that argument is true or not, is how they use that argument. So the mobilization of the argument, the political uses of the argument, not whether it's true or not. Same with the violence of protesters. And in other papers, we've looked into how a lot of legislation was made based on completely untrue stories about protesters. To get legislation through parliament, they made up stories about protesters where they couldn't be verified, or even the police couldn't verify. So it's not so much in this paper about whether it's true or not. It's a mobilization of information, imaginaries, meaning, symbols, and so on. But it's obviously much, much harder to do this kind of research when the ground is so unstable. It's very hard to understand how people get the information. It's also very hard then to move a country forward, because the polarization, I think, has been exacerbated by algorithm and other things, makes it much harder to recruit, because we keep in our polarized worlds. So creating a counter-hegemony here becomes much, much harder, because we're not looking at the same news. We're not looking at the same facts. We're not looking at the same truths. How can we then mobilize other people? So I think it's going to get harder to do this. I'm not sure I answer your question, Lindy, but I hope I at least touch upon it. Yeah, so of course, so this is, I read your question here, Carly. It's a good question. Of course, both the prime ministers we have in our data sample talked a lot about what is politically possible and what is not politically possible. And in Australia, this was very illustrated in the climate war. So we have quite a few prime ministers and opposition leaders who lost their jobs based on taking a position on this. So yes, they did mention it, and we haven't touched upon it so much here. We have another paper we talk more about how political representation, how this industry try to represent the people, and what is doable and not doable. So what is seen as realistic is also constructed, obviously, because it was not realistic because the fossil fuel industry opposed it, and they are quite a lot of resources. Some of you remember the resource super profit tax, where fossil fuel industry spent $21 million over more or less a month, with every newspaper, every radio show, every TV was suggesting this super tax will destroy the economy. And Kevin Rudd lost his job on that. The first thing Julia Gillard did was to say, we're not going to do that. The estimation was the industry saved $10 billion on that. So, it's quite good return. So what is seen as realistic is not necessarily whether it works or not technically. It is whether who are the resources to say what is realistic and what is not realistic. I hope that sort of answer your question, Carly.
Another question on that.
Yeah, very interesting, Dan. My question is about the ways in which these different imaginaries might play out in the regions and the communities that are most affected by the changes, and whether there's anything in your data where you have people, politicians who are representing areas thinking like the Hunter, where the change is real, it's happening, and you get the sense that there's a lot of people who are in the fossil fuel industry and resent the fact that they then get labelled as climate deniers because that's their job. That's not, and so it's not that they're pushing some sort of techno fix, or it's just that this is the reality of the life that I have and the community that I live in, and that's the thing that really needs to be addressed in terms of what the dystopian or utopian vision looks like.
Yeah, so we did talk to politicians. I can't remember exact the constituents, but before I moved to Queensland, I lived 12 years in Newcastle in Australia. So I know very well about this. And when I was at Newcastle University, I was teaching MBA students, and I often had coal managers in the room suggesting, look, what do you want me to do? I have employees, I have kids, I have families. What do you want me to do? Because I would go, climate change, rah, 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 rah. And he would go, what do you want me to do? And I was trying to suggest that there's not an opposition here. You can, on one hand, support your family, arguing for resources to the region, arguing for training for your employees, supporting your kids protesting. One doesn't necessarily need to be singular. One can worry about a lot of things. And most people we've spoken to, I mean, with David's and I previous research, and I was 10 years ago, we talked to around 100 sustainability managers and CEOs for big companies. None of them, or well, actually one or two, Ernst & Young managed partner was one, and maybe a newspaper editor was one, but otherwise, these are people who care about the environment. When I speak to my community when I lived in Newcastle, very few were denying climate change. They were worried about all these things, which is justifiable and fine. But it doesn't mean we can also support other things. So I completely agree with you in that this needs to be addressed. Here we're looking at the politician lobbying groups and industry. We're not talking to the people. And we are not suggesting, so the industry is not suggesting these people are denialists. They would, on the opposite, argue for them. So when we talk to politicians, they often bring up the regional community as an argument for continuing fossil fuel. But not only regional communities, so Australia. They also suggest that in other population around Asia would also dependent on Australian coal. So we don't. This is not paper talk to people, but politicians use that argument a lot in constructing, the status quo or a techno fix. Sorry, it was a long round way, but to show that I'm well familiar with this in the sense of the key for me is not whether they are right or wrong, but whether can we hold two thoughts in the same. Like, how can we do both? How can we support the community and move?
Again, thanks, Daniel. That was very interesting. I like how you show the different. I don't know if there are political moves or discursive moves that allow you to shift from one utopia to another. But so I was first wondering, how do you know this is the full picture of the different future imaginaries? Like, where did you find them? And do you assume that, so what the industry is doing is whatever scenario is given to them, they're actually able to revert back to that utopian techno fix. That's it. That is going to create inertia. That's the idea. I was just wondering on that, how do we know that this utopian techno fix actually does create inertia? I'm with you on this. I remember going to a few conference or parties when I was doing my PhD, and industry was saying we can actually solve 70% of the emissions already, but we're not doing anything because the government is not giving us the clarity that we need. So that was an interesting discourse, I think, to justify not doing anything, but we can do this. It looks a little bit like this, but I don't know if we actually know that this.
So we in the paper doesn't, well, I obviously it might come across a little bit, but I might be a bit more concerned that maybe some of these fossil fuel executives about climate change. But we're not really suggesting that whether these are realistic or not realistic. So we just play out the imaginaries given in through the interviews. So hopefully I'm completely wrong and technical fix will solve. I mean, that would be the best scenario, that tomorrow we wake up and then we have a solution and that will be implemented and we can live ever happy after. So we're not making a judgment about the quality of the utopian arguments here. We're just saying this is the politics of utopia. Yeah. So, however, if I step outside the paper, I would suggest that this is creating a status quo because carbon capture storage is not really taking off. It's in when it's used in the US or the Biden's Inflation Act, it comes with quite a lot of green deals and money to these kind of solutions. Most of the money goes to Chevron and those who use it what they do is use the storage to explore new fossil fuel. So they pump down the gas, the fossil fuel, the emissions to then be able to pump up new fossil fuel. So it's not really changing anything. So in that sense, it's a continuation of the status quo. But the quality of the utopian and dystopian, we're not really arguing it. So whether there are others, perhaps, but we did analyze, and I have obviously, classical tables or how we code and stuff in the paper. But so this is the argument from the fossil fuel. These are the key imagine they allowed out. This we suggest is how they use it in utopian politics. Of course, there might be more different imaginaries, but these were the main ones we discovered. We are not suggesting we saturated the field of imaginaries.
In the paper, the hegemony resides in the industry as a kind of construct, which includes in the people who you interviewed, people who also sit outside the industry.
Yeah.
So I guess there's a kind of question I have around where it resides, because I was really interested in your conclusion around the anti.
Yes. Yeah.
And how that would be theoretically mobilized in a sense. Like, where does it reside?
Yeah. So here hegemony we don't attach to a particular people as such. We attach that to the creation of what is seen as a social order, what is seen as normal, common sense. Obviously, there are certain actors here, like the fossil fuel industry, with in this association, lobbyist group, and politicians. I mean, McCavan, when he resigned from being a resource minister, he thanked the fossil fuel industry for being able to represent them. He didn't thank his constituents who voted for him. He thanked the industry. And we can see how the revolving doors in Australia from both major parties in these in the industry suggest that there is a clear hegemony here by actors. But we're not attaching the hegemony to actors, we're attaching it to a notion of common sense. So then if you sit outside the hegemony, you would be naturally the other. And your goal then would be to make you the hegemony. So counter-hegemony would mean to try to capture people to bring to your coalition. So you want to guess that renewable becomes the common sense if you are from that side. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it still doesn't answer the part around the anti-utopia.
All right, so anti-utopia, we use this, I guess, to the idea that for opening up. So on one hand, we have real utopia, Eric Olin writes, ideas around there are existing places we can draw upon. But one argument they're not taking hold, one argument they are dismissed is because we're not open up the possibilities for anti-utopia in the sense of providing critique of this status quo argument. We're not opening up the possible worlds. So we are utopian thinking in that sense. We need alternative utopias and that is not seen as dark or naive. Sorry, I think that's the best I can do at the moment. David?
I'm assuming that the interviews that lie behind the study took place in a particular window, should we say, moment in time that's a little while ago.
Yes.
Right. Thinking about the book and so on when it came out as well. So I guess my question is asking you to be a little speculative, but if you were to step back and look at the landscape now, socio-political landscape, shall we call it, compared to when you did the interviews, do you think you'd find either new constructed imageries, or within your existing four, would you find a very different components, elements to them? And I'm thinking, for example, that the political landscape. You pointed out there's this middle political ground. Actually, it's quite expansive and quite influential. It's the educated, for want of a better term, middle class and they have particular views. You have an intriguing rise of the sort of right in the country with strange views.
Yeah.
You've got a strong green political element plus, how do you see that playing out now in relation to how the study was carried out in the past?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the interviews were done between 2018 and 2022. So no, they are getting 4 years old now. It's 5. So it's absolutely a fair question. I don't think it looks that different. I'm sorry, I wish I could say different, but I think if anything, climate change has lost its momentum. And I think what we've seen is fossil fuel now using critical minerals as the key argument. So the big industry is not talking much about climate change, they're talking about critical minerals. So even though 90% of the profit comes from coal, we are the key for the future. We dig for critical minerals, which is needed for the energy transition. So there are some key signifiers, I guess, who's popping up. The strong right-wing movement is quite clearly affiliated with regional Australia in the sense of continuing coal mining. The sensible centre, I don't think there's any doubt that Albanese is trying to capture that, but opening up new coal mines, supporting gas with infrastructure, but at the same time saying we need to do our bits for climate change, which is really that broad coalition that try to make sure that if you care about the environment, you can still vote for Labour because they care, rather than saying it doesn't exist. If you are having a big car and you want to fly to Europe on your holidays, you can also vote for Labour because they're supporting the energy, they're doing that. So I think they managed quite well in creating this quite big coalition of different demands and holding them together quite well, and doesn't seem to be much challenge at the moment.
There's one at the back as well.
There's one at the back, and then before Yaku got doubling up.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and articulate this. Let me see if I get it across. I'm glad that you bring that sort of timeline to frame. I say we did the studies back then. How is it looking now? When we think about utopias, we think about this beautiful or this ideal of like a fixed term ideal, right? It's never going to be fixed because again, the world is ever changing. So the idea of a utopia has to be seen as a point in time. It's a picture of the frame where everything is moving. So this, I think, applies to all of the agendas, the AI agenda, the geopolitical agenda, the climate agenda. So if we think about it, about outside the climate agenda theme, it just brings to context a more structural way of how we deal with change across, these pictures, and how that framework of getting together, discussing things, and sort of doing this across sort of the agendas in the global context. So AI. So it feels like we're just very sluggish in this, and we're not very agile. Because at the end of the day, this or this or this, it's never going to be static.
No, I completely agree. And if you look at AI and the main tech bros coming out of Silicon Valley, they at the same time provide a utopian thinking, like AI is going to solve everything. Bill Gates is now coming in and saying, look, don't invest on climate change, just invest in AI, because then that will solve it. Because we're all going to get rid of our diseases. At the same time, the same tech bros the next day tweet that, no, if you don't do something like this, the robot's going to take over and kill us all. So this utopian play can also be done to make sure that you get more responsibilities. So investments. So you can also see when they use these utopian politics for what purposes. So when they want investments, most places are putting some billions into AI, they would go, look, we can address this, we can solve this, we just need another $100 billion or so. When they're pushing for legislation, they might use other aspects of this. So we're not arguing to provide utopian as perfect future places. We're looking into the politics of utopia, which I completely agree can be applied or discussed in terms of other contexts. I'm happy for you to show more on the things.
No, I'm just flagging that we need to find ways to be more agile in bringing that conversation, because it's sort of intergenerational issue. As the picture frame moves, the issues change. The climate agenda is going to change. It's never going to. We may get across net zero, but then there's the nature positive thing, and then there's the other thing. And we're going to be addressing things all the time. How do we get policy? How do we get technology and that intergenerational conversation being healthy? I'm not suggesting an answer. I'm just
So in our research in general, we're thinking with Chris and Vanessa, we do think a lot of decentralization aspect, democracy aspects, experimentations is needed, and that we open up the field of possibility. That there's no, the worst thing for the current is that there seems to be no other alternative. And I think all of these, there are alternatives, there are other discussions, there are other possibilities, and they need to be experimented with, they need to be discussed. And for us, a lot of the problem with hegemony is democracy and the lack of participation, the lack of involvement. So while Australia has, I think, a great thing with compulsory voting, which we see in a lot of countries don't, but even so, voting is not necessarily democratic participation in a good sense, a real sense, where we can engage people much more. And I don't think only democratic participation is good to establish better decision, more alternative, having better discussions. It's also good for the communities. So we know that climate assemblies, and we had that in pointing at you, Melody, in France, the climate assembly for that Macron put up. The ideas of that climate assembly was amazing, but they did obviously only implemented those that were friendly for corporations. But the ideas, if you look at what they came up with, fantastic. And these were normal people just leading discussions on climate change and having perhaps experts who just guide them. But it was people's ideas. So I think this is needed. among many other things. I also think if we have more democratic involvement, if we have more discussion, more community involvement, more community ownership, when things happen, we perhaps can compromise, do this together rather than, you know, turning to the guns or the borders or the walls or the dangerous othering. So there's also, I think, democracy is a good practice of compromise and discussion.
I wonder if you've considered that maybe those two ideas are in competition with each other. That achieving a green utopia on a particular timeline is inherently undemocratic. And if there are examples of countries that have rapidly transformed their energy systems to a certain level while increasing democratic participation in that energy system.
So again, we're not, so the green utopia here is the utopia articulated by fossil fuel through the protesters. Is not their utopia. The utopian thinking fossil fuel industry has is more the technofix, the slow utopia, where we just continue what we're doing, but we will get there. So this is what they saying, the protesters. So the green utopia is not ours, is not the protesters, is the fossil fuels imaginary of what the green people wants. That is radical transformation tomorrow. Whether there's many green activists who think this or not is not our interest. So in that sense, we are not arguing for a green utopia. We are saying this is the fossil fuel suggesting that the protesters want green utopia. If I want to argue for anything, it would not be utopia. It would not be a green utopia, but necessary for utopian politics, so that we provide future possibilities. And I would not necessarily create speed on that. I would create democracy on that. How? Well, so community-owned energy, we're governed by communities. We could have assemblies where we take decision on what kind of climate policies directed by people. There are a few different practices where deliberation by people can come up to this. And I'm not saying that will perhaps work, but I think at least we will have a discussion of possibilities, which I think at the moment, at least in Australia, we do not have much of.
Should that democracy come with really good awareness and education? Because this is going to sound awful, but the sustainability agenda needs to be well aware of the science, of the complexities, but like I say, from industry, from the leaders. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation.
Yeah, I'm a bit hesitant to elitist argument that democracy is for people who are smart like me. I do think that's a dangerous argument. I do think assemblies has suggested that it's more important to have the right way to discuss than necessarily the right background knowledge. That was the last question. Oh, yes, well done.
I'm not quite sure if I do actually have a question, but I was just thinking about the element of trust in all of this and how people trust, I guess, that the coal industry is doing the right thing for the people. You talked about affordability for families in the Hunter region, etc. So I'm just wondering how that trust is enmeshed in all of this. We have clear science, and so I'm just, can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I do think there's 2 points to that. On one hand, I do think a lot of the coal industry has gained a lot of trust, but also look what they've done for these communities. I mean, they have provided a lot to these communities, and they still do. So of course, if I were living in one of these communities, I would trust that industry who provide me and my family with things, not only a job, but also resources in the community. Of course, I would trust them more. So I don't think that is a problem. The problem, I guess, is the hardened othering that necessarily means that perhaps then distrust others. So I think in today's climate, part of the problem, I guess, it's polarization, that we cannot trust people to provide and trust the scientists to be wrong about climate change. That's sort of the distance between this. And part that is not perhaps now, but up to 15 years ago, there was clear tactics by the industry to ensure that Australia did not trust the science. You know, there was not only ExxonMobil who did this. There was other people doing this, like who did that through the industry associations. So while now almost everyone say we believe in climate change, this was not the case when climate change took off. There was a clear tactic to make sure that people didn't believe the scientists. And maybe this still is echoing. I don't know. It's not.
Daniel, thanks so much for your for what's a really thoughtful, thought-provoking talk, and for your engagement with our many questions.
Thank you.
I'm sure everyone's got different takeaways from the talk today, but for me, if nothing else, I think you've given us a great lens to for me, certainly it's a great lens to think about and understand why actually the transition to net zero is proceeding at such a slow pace, and why that continues to be, not just previously at the time of the interview, but why that actually continues to be the case now. Really great way of thinking about that. So please join me in thanking Daniel for a fantastic talk.